June 26, 1944. Hollandia Air Base, Dutch New Guinea. The tropical rain had just stopped, and mist hung low over the jungle like breath from an unseen giant. Inside a rough-built hut that smelled of coffee and engine oil, two men sat over an unfinished checkers game. Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald, commander of the 475th Fighter Group, the legendary Satan's Angels, looked up as someone knocked on the screen door. The stranger wore khaki, no insignia, and carried himself with the quiet assurance of someone used to engines, not rank. "Charles Lindbergh," he said simply. For a heartbeat, MacDonald thought he had misheard. The Charles Lindbergh? The man who had crossed the Atlantic alone 17 years ago? What was he doing on the edge of the Pacific War, thousands of miles from home? Lindbergh explained he was there as a technical representative, a civilian consultant studying P-38 Lightning operations. But his tone carried something else, something like purpose. He wasn't here to watch. He was here to fly. MacDonald, still half distracted by the checkerboard, smiled politely and went back to his game. The Army Air Forces had no shortage of self-important civilians. But this one, this man with the cool blue eyes, would soon rewrite how every pilot in the Pacific managed fuel, flight, and fear. Over the next 6 weeks, Lindbergh would teach the 475th a method so simple and so contrary to doctrine that most called it suicidal. Yet it would add nearly 400 miles of range to America's premier twin-engine fighter. Missions that once ended with empty tanks and prayers would finish with an hour of fuel to spare. And for the men who flew over endless ocean, that hour meant life itself. But to understand how a civilian could change the rhythm of a war, you have to go back to 1927, to a fragile silver monoplane named the Spirit of St. Louis. He was 25, a male pilot from the Midwest with hands cracked by cold and a map held together by hope. When Charles Lindbergh lifted off from Roosevelt Field on May 20th, the sky was gray, the air heavy with the smell of rain and gasoline. He flew alone for 33.5 hours, 3,600 miles from New York to Paris, without forward visibility, navigating by a periscope and dead reckoning. Every minute was a math problem. Every gallon of fuel a prayer. When he landed at Le Bourget with 85 gallons left, experts said it was impossible. The fuel economy he achieved with a Whirlwind radial engine defied everything pilots believed. That obsession with efficiency became his signature. Through the 1930s, mapping routes for Pan American Airways across the Pacific, he refined a system of engine management built on numbers, not instincts. He discovered that every engine, every propeller, every manifold had a hidden sweet spot, a balance of RPM, pressure, and mixture where range multiplied. By 1944, Lindbergh's grasp of that balance was unmatched, yet politics had made him a pariah. His pre-war isolationism, his speeches warning against U.S. involvement in Europe, and his uneasy admiration of German technology had angered President Roosevelt. After a public feud, Lindbergh resigned his reserve commission. When Pearl Harbor burned, he tried to rejoin the Army Air Forces. Roosevelt personally blocked the application. So Lindbergh found another way. He joined United Aircraft Corporation as a civilian consultant. No rank, no uniform, just a slide rule and an unshakable belief in precision. He tested Corsairs for Vought, flew P-47 Thunderbolts for engine data, and helped Ford troubleshoot B-24 Liberator production lines. But it wasn't enough. He wanted to be where the equations mattered, in combat. In April 1944, he quietly packed a khaki flight suit, bought a plain naval uniform without insignia, and boarded a transport bound for the South Pacific. The mission was officially technical observation. In reality, it was exile turned into purpose. He arrived among the Marines at Guadalcanal and quickly turned theory into action. When he taught Corsair pilots how to double their bomb load without crashing, accident rates dropped overnight. Word spread, Lindbergh, the civilian, could fly, By June, he heard rumors of a unit called the 475th Fighter Group, men who flew the long-legged P-38 Lightning deep into enemy territory. If any aircraft could test his ideas of range and economy, it was the Lightning. 2 Allison V-1710 engines, twin booms like a Predator's wings, and a cockpit cramped as a coffin. So he hitched a ride to Hollandia, where MacDonald and his aces were fighting a war of distance, targets so far that pilots often limped home on fumes. To Lindbergh, it was a perfect laboratory. To MacDonald, it was another responsibility in a sky already filled with risk. At dawn, the next day, the experiment began. The weather was brutal. Rain, low cloud, heavy air. 4 P-38s took off toward Jeffman Island, engines howling over the jungle. Lindbergh flew as Blue 3 on the wing of Major Thomas McGuire, already an ace with 15 kills. To the young men around him, the 42-year-old civilian looked almost fragile inside his flight suit. But when the formation banked into attack, he moved with them. Steady, precise, effortless. They strafed enemy barges through flak bursts that tore at the clouds. When they returned to base 6 hours later, the mechanics noticed something strange. Every P-38 came home with nearly empty tanks. Every one, except Lindbergh's. His still had fuel. A lot of it. At first, they thought the gauge was broken. But flight after flight, the pattern held. Same missions, same distances, same speed. And Lindbergh always landed with a margin others didn't. MacDonald called a meeting. Under the tin roof of the makeshift rec hall, surrounded by ping-pong tables and smoking lamps, the colonel asked Lindbergh to explain himself. The room fell silent. And then, the man without a uniform began to teach America's best fighter pilots something they had never learned in any school. They were told it would destroy their engines. Lindbergh told them it would save their lives. Inside the crude recreation hut of the 475th Fighter Group, the air smelled of sweat, kerosene, and damp canvas. Beneath a roof of palm leaves and rough timber, dozens of pilots gathered, still in their flight suits, faces streaked with oil and exhaustion. Some sat on ammunition crates, others leaned against the walls, arms folded. At the front stood the man who had crossed an ocean alone 17 years earlier, the civilian who somehow kept returning from combat with more fuel than anyone else. Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald didn't speak long. "Gentlemen, Mr. Lindbergh has something to show us." Then he stepped aside. Lindbergh picked up a stick of chalk and faced the blackboard. He drew 2 axes, labeling one RPM and the other manifold pressure. The pilots watched in silence. He explained that the standard procedure, 2,200 to 2,400 RPM, mixture set to auto-rich, burned fuel faster than anyone realized. "You're running your engines like race cars," he said calmly, fast, loud, and wasteful. Then he wrote new numbers. 1,600 RPM, 30 inches of mercury, mixture auto-lean. Gasps filled the room. Several men shook their heads. "That's over square," someone muttered. "It'll blow the jugs off," another whispered. Every pilot had been taught since flight school that manifold pressure must never exceed RPM divided by 100. It was one of the golden rules of piston aviation. Break it, and your engine would detonate from pre-ignition, melt a cylinder head, and tear itself apart. To run over square was to flirt with death. But Lindbergh's voice stayed even, almost clinical. "I've flown this way on every mission," he said. "No detonation, no overheating. Cylinder head temperatures are actually lower." He explained the logic. At high RPM, the engine performed many small, inefficient combustion cycles per minute, wasting fuel in heat and friction. Reducing RPM and raising manifold pressure allowed each cycle to produce more torque with less wasted motion. A leaner fuel mixture, just enough for complete combustion, meant cooler cylinders and longer range. He turned to the room. "Power," he said softly, "is pressure times displacement times efficiency. Change anyone, and you change everything." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then an older pilot with oil-stained hands asked, "How much range do you think we gain?" 400 miles, Lindbergh said simply. The room erupted in low laughter, half disbelief, half nervousness. 9-hour missions in cramped cockpits already pushed the limits of human endurance. The idea of flying even farther, of sitting on parachutes for that long, sounded like punishment. But the math was solid. McDonald decided to test it. 2 mornings later, a 4-ship flight lifted off before dawn, mist curling from the runway, the jungle waking beneath. One P-38, flown by Captain Warren Lewis, used the standard cruise settings. The other 3 followed Lindbergh's formula. The engines sounded different, a slower, deeper rumble that vibrated through the fuselage like a heartbeat. The pilots watched their gauges nervously. Oil temperature, manifold pressure, cylinder head temperature. To their surprise, everything stayed within limits. When they landed, 6 hours later, the results were undeniable. Lewis's tanks were nearly dry. Lindbergh's still sloshed with over 200 gallons. Word spread through the 475th like wildfire. Pilots who had left 2 days earlier now lined up to try the Lindbergh settings. Some called it black magic, others a miracle of math. Mechanics inspected the engines afterward and found nothing wrong. No signs of stress, no cracks, no detonation. Just cooler metal and fuller tanks. Within a week, skepticism began to melt. Missions that once ended in near-empty returns now ended with safe reserves. Pilots who used to pray for tailwinds started thinking about how much farther they could go. One by one, the doubters turned believers. But understanding was one thing. Belief under fire was another. On July the 1st, the 475th flew a 6.5-hour reconnaissance along the coast of New Guinea. The jungle below was an endless green ocean, broken only by rivers of silver light. When the flight returned, Lindbergh's P-38 landed with over 210 gallons of fuel left, enough to fly another hour. The others came home nearly empty. McDonald called another meeting. This time, there was no laughter. "Gentlemen," he said, "we have just changed the range of the war." Soon, the technique spread beyond the 475th. Pilots from neighboring groups came to watch the legend himself take off, the civilian who defied both doctrine and the president. He flew as Blue 3, never as a passenger. In the air, he was one of them. Quiet, precise, lethal. Even the aces respected him. Major Thomas Maguire, who would end the war with 38 victories, later said, "The old man could fly." Lindbergh didn't stop at teaching numbers. He taught attitude, that understanding was stronger than superstition. He reminded them that most rules in aviation were not laws of physics, but boundaries drawn by comfort and fear. The P-38, with its twin engines and generous fuel supply, could afford to experiment. The Pacific was a laboratory of survival. He told them, "A man who knows his engine will live longer than a man who fears it." For the pilots of the 475th, that line became gospel. They began to feel it every time they pushed the throttles forward and settled into that low, steady hum, the sound of an aircraft flying on understanding instead of luck. By mid-July, the numbers spoke louder than any order. The group's average combat radius had grown from 570 miles to over 700. Fuel consumption had dropped by nearly 1/3. Missions that once required emergency landings on jungle strips now returned safely to Hollandia. One evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, McDonald walked with Lindbergh along the airfield. The air smelled of wet grass and avgas. P-38s sat in neat rows, their twin tails catching the red light of dusk. "You've given us something the manuals never did," McDonald said. Lindbergh smiled faintly. "Not something new," he replied, "just something that was always there, waiting to be understood." The first time Charles Lindbergh fired his guns in anger, the ocean beneath him looked like a mirror of steel. July 28, 1944, El Pudi Bay. The air was thick with heat and thunderclouds. 4 P-38 Lightnings from the 433rd Squadron cut through the sky in formation, silver wings flashing in the tropical glare. The call sign was Blue Flight. Lindbergh flew as Blue 3, tucked in tight behind Major Thomas McGuire's wing. The mission was simple on paper: escort bombers, then sweep for enemy reconnaissance planes. In reality, nothing in the Pacific was simple. Visibility flickered between brilliance and shadow, and the Japanese had a habit of appearing where no one expected them. MacDonald, flying in the lead element, spotted them first: 2 dark shapes gliding low over the water. Mitsubishi Ki-51. Sonya light bombers, returning from a patrol. Slow, underpowered, but dangerous in the hands of men who refused to die quietly. Blue Flight, tally 2 Sonyas at 11 o'clock low. The radio crackled back. Copy, let's clean them up. The P-38s rolled into the dive. Airspeed built fast, the jungle rushing up beneath. Lindbergh's twin Allisons roared at 44 inches, the cockpit trembling with power. As they closed, tracers streaked the air, green from the Sonyas, red from the Americans. The Japanese formation broke. 1 Sonya, flown by Captain Saburo Shimada, banked hard left, hugging the coastline. His wingman wasn't so lucky. A burst from Lieutenant Wade Lewis tore through its fuselage. Flames blossomed along the left wing. The bomber nosed down and smashed into the surf, disappearing in a sheet of white spray. Shimada's plane kept fighting. He threw the Sonya into desperate turns, the heavier lightnings overshooting again and again. For half an hour the chase twisted across the bay, silver against green, roaring engines echoing off the mountains. Lindbergh held back, watching, calculating. The Sonya's pilot was skillful. Too skillful. Every time a P-38 lined up, Shimada reversed his bank, forcing the Americans to overshoot. The air smelled of cordite and salt. Sweat stung Lindbergh's eyes. Then the Sonya straightened, a fatal decision. He saw the moment open, pure and mathematical. Distance 400 yards. Closure rate 500 miles per hour. A single head-on pass. Shimada came straight for him. Lindbergh squeezed the trigger. The P-38's nose erupted in fire, 1 20mm cannon, 4 50-caliber machine guns spitting a storm of light. The Sonya's propeller slowed, sparks bursting from its cowl. Smoke poured from the radial engine. For a heartbeat, both planes hurtled at each other, trapped in momentum and will. Then, Lindbergh yanked the yoke back, pulling up so violently that the harness cut into his shoulders. The Japanese bomber flashed beneath, so close he could see the pilot's white scarf whipping in the wind. Then it plunged, trailing smoke, diving straight into the sea. The impact sent a column of water skyward, then nothing but spreading foam. Radio silence followed. Only the engines remained, steady, low, the impossible rhythm of 1,600 RPM. Blue Flight, reform on me, MacDonald called it last. Let's go home. No one mentioned the kill. Lindbergh was a civilian, and civilians weren't supposed to fight. But every man in that flight knew what they'd seen. The impossible fuel theorist had just survived his first dogfight and won. When they landed at Hollandia, the ground crews gathered as if drawn by rumor. The story spread before Lindbergh even climbed from the cockpit. A civilian had gone head-to-head with a Japanese officer and walked away alive. The mechanics checked his engines first, cylinder heads cool, manifolds clean, oil pressure perfect. Nothing about the aircraft suggested danger, nothing that matched the fear pilots once felt at those forbidden over-square settings. MacDonald watched silently, hands on his hips. The experiment was no longer theory. It had been tested under fire. That night, over tin cups of coffee in the mess tent, he spoke quietly to his operations officer. He's proven it twice now, in math and in blood. The next morning, Lindbergh was in the air again. By August 1st, the Pacific seemed to turn against them. A mission to the Palau Islands met heavy resistance, swirling dogfights against Japanese Zeros. The sky was chaos, white clouds torn apart by gunfire, the smell of cordite thick in every breath. Lindbergh found himself cornered, a Zero sliding onto his tail. The canopy filled with streaks of green tracer. He felt the thud of bullets through the fuselage, the jolt of metal hitting metal. For the first time, the man who had flown oceans felt death reaching through the glass. Break right, McDonald's voice shouted over the radio. Lindbergh rolled, wings groaning just as McDonald dove past and cut across the Zero's line of fire. The enemy overshot, climbing into a burst of .50 caliber fury. A heartbeat later, the Zero exploded in a cloud of fire and falling parts. Silence again. Just the low hum of throttled engines and the rhythmic vibration of two Allisons running over square, cool, calm, alive. When they returned to base, headquarters had already decided. The brass could no longer ignore the headlines whispered across the squadrons. Lindbergh's flying combat. He had flown nearly 50 missions, destroyed an enemy aircraft, and nearly been killed himself. The 5th Air Force ordered him home before Washington learned too much. On August 12, 1944, the pilots of the 475th gathered by the runway. McDonald shook his hand. "You came to teach," he said, "but you fought beside us. That's more than most ever do." Lindbergh smiled faintly. "All I did was measure." He climbed into the transport, engines droning as the plane lifted into the dawn. Below him, rows of P-38s gleamed in the sunlight, machines now capable of flying farther, fighting longer, and returning safer than ever before. That day, the men of the 475th realized something profound. The change wasn't in the metal or the fuel. It was in the mindset. The belief that precision mattered more than superstition, that even in war the smallest adjustment could save lives. The impossible fuel hack was no longer a rumor. It was doctrine written in flight logs, in fuel gauges, and in the steady heartbeat of engines that refused to quit. From then on, whenever a young pilot questioned the strange low rumble of the Lightnings cruising over square, veterans would smile and say, "That's the sound of Lindbergh's math, the sound of coming home." The first reports arrived quietly, numbers typed on thin paper carried by couriers between humid tents across the Pacific. They spoke of P-38 squadrons flying farther than anyone thought possible, of pilots returning from 9-hour missions with fuel still sloshing in their tanks. At first, the higher command dismissed it as rumor, but the data from Hollandia kept coming, and the math refused to lie. What began as an unrecorded experiment by one civilian in June had become a ripple spreading across thousands of miles of ocean by August. P-38 groups in New Guinea, the Solomons, and even the Marianas started adopting the Lindbergh settings. Each unit made small adjustments, 1,700 RPM instead of 1,600, a little more manifold pressure for altitude, a touch richer mixture at climb. But the principle was the same: low speed, high torque, lean burn, long life. And the results were transforming the Pacific War. Before Lindbergh's arrival, every fighter mission in the Southwest Pacific was a race against the fuel gauge. Targets like the Vogelkop Peninsula or the enemy fields at Halmahera lay hundreds of miles beyond the normal reach of escort fighters. Bomber crews often flew alone, unprotected, because the fighters simply couldn't go that far and return. To fly too far was to drown in the ocean or vanish in the jungle. But now, those impossible distances were shrinking. By late July 1944, P-38s from the 475th Fighter Group were flying 750-mile strikes with time to loiter over the target. By early August, other units were pushing to 900. One pilot wrote in his logbook, "We used to count the miles to home. Now we count the miles we can still go." To understand what that meant, imagine a map of the Pacific, a vast emptiness dotted with tiny islands, each one a stepping stone of war. Every mile of range was a choice: which island to invade, which to skip. General Douglas MacArthur's island-hopping strategy depended entirely on where his aircraft could reach. Before, his planners had been forced to capture every airfield along the way, losing thousands of men just to get close enough for fighter cover. Now, with Lindbergh's efficiency techniques, they could leap farther, bypass strongholds, and close on the Philippines faster than anyone predicted. The strategic effect was enormous. Operations that would have taken months were compressed into weeks. Long-range sweeps could strike Japanese positions deep inside the archipelagos, cutting off supply lines and air support. Enemy bases that had once been considered safe now woke to the howl of P-38 engines at dawn, aircraft they had never expected to reach that far. It wasn't firepower that changed the balance. It was endurance. Each extra hour of fuel was an hour of control. Over the skies, over time, over fear itself. In September 1944, a young pilot named Lieutenant Jim Landers flew a mission to Sierra My Land. The flight plan predicted barely enough fuel to return. Using the new cruise method, his section reached the target, circled for 10 minutes under cloud cover, and returned with 50 gallons in reserve. He later wrote, "We started calling it the Lindy Stretch, like he'd stretched the ocean itself." And, in a sense, he had. The Pacific was no longer just geography, it was a mathematical equation that Lindbergh had rewritten. The impossible was becoming standard procedure. Commanders noticed. General George Kenney of the 5th Air Force, a man known for his skepticism toward civilians, personally reviewed the logs from the 475th. He found no increase in engine failures, no signs of stress damage, and fuel savings that bordered on miraculous. Quietly, he authorized the distribution of Lindbergh's technique throughout the theater. It wasn't an order. It didn't have to be. Pilots trusted results more than memos. Within weeks, the technique reached the 8th and 49th Fighter Groups, then others beyond New Guinea. By October, Lindbergh's name appeared informally in briefings. Use the Lindbergh setting for cruise. The man who had once been banned from military service was now, without rank or uniform, influencing how the U.S. Air Forces fought a continent-sized war. By the time MacArthur's troops landed at Leyte in October 1944, the difference was visible in every corner of the sky. P-38s, once limited to short-range strikes, were now escorting bombers hundreds of miles beyond the front. They could cover invasions, pursue retreating Japanese convoys, and still make it home. One mission report from the 431st Squadron reads, 9 hours aloft, 890 miles covered, 15 minutes of combat over target, all aircraft returned safely. 9 hours. That number would have been laughed out of a briefing room 6 months earlier. Now it was routine. The Japanese noticed, too. Pilots who once felt secure beyond the range of American fighters now found lightnings overhead. They called them the Long Ghosts. Planes that appeared out of nowhere, fought, and disappeared before pursuit was possible. Fuel, it turned out, was not just energy. It was time, and time in war was power. But not everyone celebrated. Some senior officers in Washington remained uncomfortable. Lindbergh was still politically radioactive, a man once accused of Nazi sympathy. His name was never mentioned in official communiqué. Reports referred only to revised engine management practices. Yet, among the men who flew, his identity was no secret. One mechanic scratched the words Lindbergh's Law on the side of a drop tank. Another painted 600 RPM Club on his flight jacket. It was their private code, respect disguised as humor. And at the front, far from politics, the results spoke louder than reputation. Planes flew farther. Pilots came home. That was what mattered. By November, the new efficiency was shaping strategy itself. The 5th Air Force could now project fighter cover across the central Philippines. This allowed rapid seizure of airfields, smoother coordination with Navy carriers, and fewer ground assaults. For every pilot who landed safely with fuel to spare, there was a soldier who lived because the air cover never left. The historians would later call it logistics. The men who lived through it called it a miracle of math. One evening at Hollandia, weeks after Lindbergh had returned to the United States, MacDonald walked the runway alone. The jungle hummed with insects. A line of P-38s glowed silver under the moonlight. Each one carried not just ammunition, but knowledge. A way of flying that turned danger into margin. He paused beside one aircraft and rested his hand on the cool metal skin. Somewhere, far across the Pacific, war was still raging. But here, in the quiet, he could almost hear the low hum of those twin engines, running smooth and steady at 1,600 RPM. The sound of survival, the sound of understanding. War, at its core, had always belonged to instinct, to the sharp reflex, the gut decision, the man who acted before he thought. But in the summer of 1944, over the steaming jungles and endless sea of the Pacific, that idea began to shift. The quiet revolution Charles Lindbergh had started wasn't just mechanical, it was philosophical. He had not only taught the pilots of the 475th Fighter Group to save fuel, he had taught them to think differently. Before, combat flying had been ruled by feeling. Pilots talked about listening to the engines, about trusting the sound, the vibration, the pulse under their boots. Manuals existed, but instinct ruled the cockpit. The men of the air war were trained to act like predators, to hunt, not to calculate. Numbers belonged to engineers on the ground, not to aces in the sky. But the civilian who had crossed an ocean alone brought something the war had nearly forgotten: patience, precision, and faith in measurement. When Lindbergh stood in front of those young men, his hair streaked with gray and his voice calm as a metronome, he challenged their most sacred belief that survival came from courage alone. Courage, without understanding, he said once to MacDonald, is just another word for luck. It was a sentence the colonel never forgot. As the weeks passed, something strange began to happen in the 475th. Pilots started keeping more detailed notes after each mission, not just enemy encounters, but manifold pressure, mixture, temperature, altitude. They compared numbers in the mess hall the way gamblers compared cards. They argued over decimal points. It was the birth of a new kind of flying, empirical, disciplined, almost scientific. The more they measured, the more they understood how much they didn't know. They realized that the enemy wasn't only the Zero or the Chi-61 in the clouds ahead, but also the ignorance inside their own cockpit. The Allison engines, once treated like beasts to be tamed by instinct, became instruments that responded to reason. Somewhere between science and survival, they found a new form of mastery. Major Thomas Maguire, the quiet ace who would finish the war with 38 kills, later said, "Lindbergh made us trust the numbers more than our nerves." That shift saved more lives than anyone could count. It changed how they flew, but also how they thought. Pilots began to question other truths they had been taught, rules that had never been tested, habits inherited from 1,000 flight manuals written in safer times. The Pacific had no room for superstition. It rewarded only what worked. Lindbergh's success proved something no general could deny. Knowledge, when tested by experience, was more reliable than any doctrine. At night, after missions, the airfield would go dark except for the low glow of lamps beneath the wings. Mechanics wiped oil from their hands while pilots stared at the engines that had carried them home. They spoke quietly about power and endurance, about how those same machines that once felt fragile now seemed almost alive, as if they too understood the rhythm of survival. "You can feel it," one pilot said. "When you fly her right, the lightning breathes easier." They had started to listen again, but this time not with instinct, with comprehension. That shift in attitude rippled outward. Other squadrons began adopting the Lindbergh mindset. Engineers collaborated more directly with pilots. asking for feedback instead of dictating procedures. Maintenance crews started recording detailed performance logs. The air war became, piece by piece, a more intelligent machine. Lindbergh's influence turned the cockpit from a place of reaction into a place of reflection, even amid chaos. And reflection had a strange way of humanizing war. When you slowed the engines to 1,600 RPM, the noise softened. The vibrations lessened. The long-range flights became hours of thought. Pilots stared at the horizon, hearing only the heartbeat of twin Allisons thrumming evenly through the airframe. It gave them time to feel something no one expected in combat: clarity. They thought about home, about why they were there, about what kind of men they were becoming. Flying slower somehow made them more aware of everything that moved faster than they did. The passing of time, the loss of friends, the fragility of life. In letters home, many began to write differently. Less bravado, more reflection. One young lieutenant, after his 50th mission, wrote to his wife, "He taught us how to save gas, but what he really taught us was how to breathe again." That was Lindbergh's true gift, not just range, but rhythm. He showed them that control was not the enemy of courage, that intellect and instinct could exist in harmony. He made precision feel heroic. By autumn 1944, that philosophy had spread through the entire 5th Air Force. Pilots who had never met Lindbergh were using his methods, speaking his language, and embodying his discipline. The phrase, "fly smart," became a quiet mantra across the Pacific. In an age defined by brute force, one man had proven that mastery could be gentler, calmer, and infinitely more powerful. But even as his influence grew, Lindbergh himself had already returned to the United States, uncelebrated, unmentioned, and largely unknown for what he had done. His name was too politically stained to appear in official reports. The papers back home still remembered the isolationist, not the teacher who had saved lives. To the world, he was silent again. But in the Pacific, his silence had turned into sound. The deep, steady hum of engines cruising over square, hour after hour, carrying men safely across impossible distances. MacDonald once wrote in his journal after the war, "He made us question everything we thought we knew, and in doing so, he made us better men, not just better pilots." That was the real range Lindbergh gave them, not measured in miles, but in understanding. By October 1944, the map of the Pacific had changed. Lines once drawn by fuel limits had vanished. The blue expanse that separated island from island, once a wall of distance and death, had become a sky of possibility. The American P-38 Lightning, once bound by its thirst, now roamed like a wolf that had learned to hunt without resting. The change was quiet, almost invisible. There were no new factories, no miracle engines, no secret weapons. Only a new way of thinking, a recalibration of trust between man, machine, and mathematics. Yet that small shift redrew the front lines of the Pacific War. In the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur's return was underway. His promise, "I shall return," depended not on speeches, but on fuel and range. Without fighter cover, the convoys, bombers, and landing craft would be sitting targets for the Japanese. But with Lindbergh's principles now woven into flight manuals, the P-38s could do what no American fighter had done before: reach the Philippines from bases in New Guinea and Morotai, fight, and return. That meant MacArthur could invade sooner, strike deeper, and risk less. On October 20th, 1944, as the first waves of troops waded onto Ladies' Beaches, the sky above them thundered with the sound of twin Allisons. P-38s flew overhead in tight formation, long, sleek, silver, their propellers glinting like coins in the morning sun. Each plane carried the echo of Lindbergh's classroom in Hollandia. Low RPM, 30 inches of pressure, lean mixture, steady heartbeat. The pilots joked about it in their call signs. Blue 3, Angel 16, Lindbergh lead. They didn't care about politics. They cared that the gauges stayed green, the engines stayed cool, and the range stretched farther than any general had dared hope. From the ground, soldiers watched the lightning circle above like guardian spirits. Untouchable, the word that had inspired the legend. In combat reports, the transformation was measured in data, but its true impact was human. Pilots no longer returned shaking from fear of empty tanks. Missions that once ended in ditching at sea now ended in laughter, in stories told under the soft whir of generators. For the first time, the Pacific sky began to feel conquerable. The 475th Fighter Group, Satan's Angels, led many of these missions. They struck Japanese convoys off Mindanao, escorted bombers across Leyte Gulf, and patrolled the corridors between the islands. The enemy, expecting short-range interceptors, was caught unprepared. Zeros scrambled late, often arriving to find the Americans already on their way home. In just a few months, the statistics told a new story. Increased mission duration, reduced loss rates, higher success ratios. But behind those sterile numbers was something living, a belief that limits were illusions. Lindbergh's impossible trick had turned endurance into a weapon, and endurance changed everything. Fighters could now escort bombers on long raids that reached Japanese strongholds untouched before. P-38s accompanied B-25s and B-24s across seas so wide they once demanded entire refueling operations. Every extra mile meant more options, and in war, options were victory. With each mission, American control expanded like ripples across water. Bases once thought unreachable were now within range of lightning strikes. Japanese supply lines shrank under relentless pressure. It wasn't brute force that achieved this. It was efficiency, precision, and calm logic applied to chaos. Yet, for all its strategic brilliance, the real miracle lay in the ordinary moments of survival. In December 1944, a typhoon struck as a patrol returned from Luzon. The sky turned black, the rain like bullets. Lightning flashed around the lightnings, nature mocking its own creation. One pilot, Lieutenant Joe Raines, radioed that he was lost. His compass dead, visibility zero. He had barely enough fuel for 20 minutes. "Trust the Lindy settings," came the calm voice of his wingman. Raines throttled back, leaned the mixture, and slowed his breathing to match the steady rhythm of the engines. Minutes stretched like hours. Then, through the curtain of rain, he saw a faint glow. The airfield lights at Morotai. He landed with fuel still in his tanks. Later, he wrote, "I never met Lindbergh, but that night, his math kept me alive." Across the Pacific, stories like that became folklore. Mechanics would tap a fuel gauge after long flights and mutter, "Lindy's ghost rides with us." Pilots carried the knowledge like a quiet superstition, not magical, but sacred. They had learned that survival was not a matter of luck, but of understanding. The P-38 had become a symbol of that balance, a machine of beauty and logic. Its twin booms gave it strength, its central pod precision. It was neither brute nor beast, but a thinking predator. In a way, Lindbergh's influence had humanized the airplane. He made it something to be known, not just used. By early 1945, the Lightning's extended reach had reshaped the rhythm of the Pacific. Fighters now flew nearly 1,000 miles, striking deep into the heart of the Japanese perimeter. They patrolled the skies over Mindoro, Luzon, and even Formosa. Targets once considered beyond range were now routine. The logistics of war, fuel, distance, time, had bowed to a simple truth. Knowledge multiplies power. Every drop of fuel, every degree of heat, every revolution per minute was no longer random. It was part of a symphony. Lindbergh had given them the sheet music, but he had also given them something more. A reminder that progress often comes from the uninvited, the underestimated, the one who dares to question the manual. He had walked into their world as an outsider, challenged their rules, and left them with a new one, that every system, no matter how advanced, can still be improved by those who truly listen. The pilots of the 475th carried that lesson long after the war. When they heard the low drone of a P-38 in their memories, they didn't just remember the battles. They remembered the silence between them, the long stretches of sky where a man and a machine flew in perfect understanding. By the time the war drew toward its end, the phrase Lindbergh's Law had become part of the pilot's vocabulary, passed from briefing to briefing like a secret handshake. Few outside the squadrons ever knew where it came from. Even fewer understood how one quiet civilian had stretched not just the range of their aircraft, but the range of their thinking. The Pacific War would move on, to bigger planes, to jet engines, to other names and other heroes. But in that fragile window between old and new, a man with no uniform had proven something eternal, that the mind is the ultimate fuel, and those who master it can make even a mortal machine almost immortal. History is often written by the victors, but edited by the comfortable. And comfort, as always, prefers simplicity. Heroes must be clean, enemies must be clear, and anything in between must be quietly set aside. That is what happened to Charles Lindbergh. By the winter of 1945, his name had already begun to fade from the official story. The war in the Pacific raged on, but the reports sent back to Washington spoke of improved flight endurance, revised engine protocols, new efficiency standards. Nowhere did they mention the man who had made those miracles possible. To the bureaucrats, he was still the isolationist, the man who had stood before microphones in 1941 and pleaded for peace, too close to Germany for comfort. In the eyes of the White House, Lindbergh was a reminder of a political wound that had never healed. To give him credit now, to acknowledge that the same man had quietly changed the course of the air war, would mean reopening that wound. So, they didn't. Instead, the credit went to technical officers, to engineering liaisons, to the faceless machinery of the war effort. The equations were kept, the name erased. When Lindbergh returned to the United States in August 1944, he landed quietly with no ceremony, no press. He wore no medals, carried no trophies, only a journal and a handful of flight data. He returned to a nation that preferred to remember him as a controversy, not a savior. Even his request to share his findings formally with the Army Air Forces was met with polite dismissal. The brass nodded, took his reports, and shelved them. But the pilots in the Pacific didn't need memos to remember. They had flown with him. They had watched his hands on the throttles, heard his voice on the radio, trusted his math when their lives depended on it. To them, the record didn't need rewriting. It was written in the sky. Major Thomas McGuire, the ace who had watched Lindbergh outfly Zeros and outthink doctrine, wrote home to his family after the war. If not for that man, many of us wouldn't have come back. He taught us something they'll never print in the manuals, that intelligence is as brave as courage. Others kept quiet for years, afraid that speaking his name too loudly might draw questions from Washington. Yet, among those who had flown the P-38, the memory of Lindbergh endured like the steady hum of a cruising engine. Low, constant, undeniable. After the war, Lindbergh's public life became paradoxical. He was both revered and resented, a pioneer who had touched the divine heights of aviation and the moral ambiguities of politics. The press painted him as a fallen icon, a hero turned ghost. He spoke rarely, avoided crowds, and spent his time consulting quietly for aircraft manufacturers. But every so often at air shows or pilot reunions, an old man with sunburned skin and sharp eyes would approach him and say, "I flew with the 475th." And in that instant, Lindbergh would smile. No explanation needed, no medals required. The understanding passed silently between men who had shared something unrecorded but unforgettable. They knew. They remembered the day he stood before them, drawing diagrams on a board with a piece of chalk. The way he spoke with the certainty of experience, not authority. the way he turned fear into logic and risk into rhythm. In 1946, the Army quietly updated its P-38 manuals for training and post-war instruction. The new section on cruise control contained familiar numbers: 1600 RPM, 30 inches of manifold pressure, mixture set to lean. It cited no author, no source, just a line at the bottom: field data verified under combat conditions, 1944. That line was his epitaph inside the military's memory, anonymous but immortal. As the jet age dawned, the P-38 Lightnings were retired. Their propellers fell silent, replaced by the shriek of turbines. To younger pilots, the old twin-boom fighter became a relic, a museum piece. But to those who had flown it, each gleaming rivet still carried the echo of a time when one man's curiosity stretched the limits of what was possible. Some veterans formed the P-38 Association after the war. They restored aircraft, held reunions, shared stories. And somewhere, always, someone mentioned Lindbergh. Not as a celebrity, not as a headline, but as a comrade. At one reunion in the early 1970s, an aging mechanic named Warren Lewis, who had once checked Lindbergh's engines after those first missions in Hollandia, stood up and spoke. His voice trembled, but his words were steady. "They called it a trick," he said. But it wasn't. It was understanding. He didn't just make the P-38 fly farther, he made us all think farther. The room fell silent. For a moment, the past lived again. The roar of engines, the smell of avgas, the distant memory of fear turning into trust. By then, Lindbergh himself was fading. The years had gentled him. He spent his final days in Hawaii, far from headlines, watching the sunrise over the Pacific, the same ocean whose skies he had once transformed. When he died in 1974, there was no military funeral, no 21-gun salute. Just 15 people, a handmade coffin, and a line from the Psalms carved into stone. "If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea," fitting words for a man who had once lived in the sky. History books would remember Lindbergh for 1927, for the flight to Paris, for the moment when one man conquered an ocean of air. But those who truly knew him, the men of the Pacific, remembered him for something quieter, something far more human. He had not conquered distance. He had understood it. And in doing so, he gave the war a different kind of victory, not one measured in kills or medals, but in miles and minds. The roar of piston engines faded slowly from the world, like a long exhale after decades of breathless invention. By the 1950s, the warbirds that had once ruled the skies were disappearing into museums and scrapyards. The P-38 Lightning, that twin-boom miracle of balance and fury, was no longer a weapon but a memory. Its silver skin dulled, its propellers frozen mid-motion. A ghost from a slower, braver time. But the lessons it carried, the quiet revolution born from Lindbergh's numbers, never truly died. They migrated, from propellers to jet turbines, from analog gauges to digital sensors, from hands-on levers to algorithms whispering through circuits. The physics of efficiency remained the same. The discipline of understanding endured. In the flight manuals of the new jet age, a small paragraph appeared under Fuel Management. Optimum cruise efficiency is achieved through low RPM, moderate thrust, and lean mixture at altitude. The numbers were different, but the thinking was identical. Lindbergh's ghost had followed aviation into the future. In classrooms at flight schools, instructors sometimes told their students about the old rule, the story of a man who dared to fly against the book and proved the book wrong. They rarely used his name. But the legend persisted, passed quietly from teacher to student like a parable. Trust your instruments, not your fear. Test with care, but never stop testing. For young pilots who grew up in the hum of jets, the idea that a man could cross an ocean with a map, a compass, and a stopwatch seemed mythic. Yet every modern aviator owed him something. Every dial that displayed fuel flow, every equation that balanced thrust against drag carried an echo of his relentless curiosity. It wasn't the machines that made him immortal. It was his method. In 1969, as Neil Armstrong stepped onto the surface of the moon, Lindbergh watched the broadcast from his home in Hawaii. The television light flickered across his face like reflected starlight. When asked later how he felt, he simply said, "We've gone farther than I ever dreamed, but we are still the same species that must learn balance." Balance, that word had guided him his entire life. Between power and restraint, between courage and calculation, between sky and earth. To him, the moon landing was not a contradiction of his legacy, but its continuation. It was the ultimate long-range flight, achieved through the same marriage of precision and imagination that had once carried him from New York to Paris, and later from Hollandia to eternity. For the veterans of the 475th Fighter Group, now gray-haired and slow-walking, the sound of an aircraft engine could still stop time. At reunions, they spoke less of combat and more of the spaces between, the hours of silence over water, the hypnotic rhythm of twin Allisons purring at 1,600 RPM, the feeling that knowledge itself could be a form of prayer. One of them, Captain Merrill Smith, once said during an interview, "He didn't just teach us how to fly farther, he taught us how to think in peace. Every pilot after that war owes him a little bit of calm." Those words became something of an epitaph for an entire generation. The technology advanced beyond anything Lindbergh could have imagined. But the philosophy he embodied, that mastery comes not from domination, but from understanding, found its way into every discipline touched by flight. Engineers designing supersonic jets cited efficiency envelopes. Astronauts spoke of energy management. Even drone operators, decades later, would rely on algorithms that mirrored the same logic. Reduce cycles, increase endurance, optimize for stability. The spirit of the Pacific, the mind that turned war into a lesson in fuel, lived on in their equations. Yet, beneath all the progress, there remained a quiet moral to his story, a warning whispered in the tone of humility. Lindbergh had seen the power of machines and the fragility of the people who built them. He knew that every advancement, no matter how brilliant, carried the risk of arrogance. In one of his final journal entries, he wrote, "Man measures the world, but rarely himself. The engine will not forgive ignorance, nor will the soul forgive excess." Those words could have been written for the jet age, for the nuclear age, for every age that believed more speed meant more wisdom. He had proven that knowledge could save lives, but he also knew that knowledge without conscience could destroy them. In 1974, the year he died, aviation magazines ran small tributes, most focused on the spirit of St. Louis, the boyish hero who had crossed the Atlantic alone. Few mentioned Hollandia, or the 475th, or the 6 weeks that had changed the war. But for those who had once flown with him, that was fine. Their memories didn't need headlines. Somewhere over the Pacific, when the wind was just right and a propeller-driven plane passed low over the sea, they could still hear it, that deep, steady pulse at 1,600 revolutions per minute. The sound of logic made human, the sound of faith made mechanical. In the end, that was Lindbergh's true legacy. Not the miles he flew, not the fame he lost, but the understanding he left behind. That technology, when guided by humility, becomes an extension of the human spirit. That mastery is not the absence of limits, but the art of knowing exactly where they are. The P-38 was long gone. The pilots had grown old. The war was history. But the idea remained that the impossible is simply what hasn't yet been understood. And in that truth, Charles Lindbergh still flies, endlessly, somewhere between the earth and the horizon, where knowledge and courage share the same sky. At the edge of every horizon, there is always another one, a line that seems final until you reach it, only to find that the sky has drawn a new boundary just beyond. For Charles Lindbergh, that truth had defined his entire life. Whether it was the Atlantic in 1927, the Pacific in 1944, or the silent emptiness of his final years in Hawaii, he had always lived where horizons met, where the known faded into the unknown and dared him to understand. Even in death, his shadow remained in motion. The skies he once ruled had become crowded with machines he could never have imagined. Jets slicing through the stratosphere, spacecraft orbiting the Earth, signals crossing continents in the blink of an eye. But every one of those triumphs still whispered the same question he had spent a lifetime answering. What lies beyond what we think we know? In the decades that followed his passing, new generations of pilots and engineers rediscovered fragments of his philosophy without realizing they were his. They studied energy management, aerodynamic flow, and efficient burn cycles, all principles born from the mind of a man who once leaned over a chalkboard in a jungle hut and drew a curve between power and endurance. What he had taught in that crude, palm-roofed room in 1944 was not just a technique. It was a way of thinking that mastery begins not with command, but with comprehension. That courage is not the absence of doubt, but the ability to measure it. Every pilot who ever adjusted a throttle with care, who ever listened to an engine's rhythm instead of shouting over it, carried a trace of him. Every scientist who ever questioned the manual before rewriting it stood in his lineage. Sometimes, in quiet airfields at dawn, old lightnings still fly. Their polished wings catch the first light, and the hum of their engines ripples across the sky. People watching from the ground see beauty, a relic from a war long gone. But, to those who understand, that sound is a language, part mathematics, part faith. The echo of a civilian who once taught warriors that survival was a form of wisdom. The P-38 was a paradox, brutal yet elegant, powerful yet precise. Like Lindbergh himself, its engines, once scorned for their complexity, had become a symbol of what could happen when understanding replaced superstition. And when one of those planes lifts off today, restored by loving hands, climbing into the same sun he once chased, it feels less like history and more like memory breathing again. The pilots who learned from him grew old, then disappeared one by one, but their testimonies remained. They spoke of him not as a myth, not even as a hero, but as something rarer. A teacher who didn't seek followers, only proof. Some men fought for glory, one veteran said near the end of his life. He fought for understanding, and he won. They had flown through storms, through tracer fire, through skies that devoured the unprepared. They had seen men with sharper reflexes and greater strength fail because they didn't listen to the quiet logic of the machine beneath them. Lindbergh's lesson had outlived the war because it was never really about fuel. It was about humility, about knowing that even in mastery, you are still a student of the world. Technology would go on to outpace everything he touched. Jet engines rendered propellers obsolete, computers replaced instinct, and spacecraft left the Earth behind entirely. But every new frontier still carried a piece of him, the echo of restraint in the age of acceleration, the reminder that faster is not always wiser, that endurance is often the truest form of strength. In the silence of space, astronauts would one day describe the same sensation he once felt over the Pacific, the hum of machinery, the pulse of trust between man and mechanism, the fragile, beautiful balance that separates life from void. That was Lindbergh's final horizon, not a place but an idea, that every human journey is a negotiation between courage and comprehension, and that only by respecting both can we cross the infinite. If you walk today along the cliffs of Kipahulu, where he is buried, you can still hear the wind from the sea that carried his last breath. The air smells of salt and earth. The palms move slowly, like the hands of time remembering. There is no monument, no grand inscription, just a slab of stone and a line from Psalm 139. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea. And perhaps that is enough. Because his legacy was never meant to stand still. It was meant to fly, endlessly, invisibly, in every mind that dares to understand rather than obey. When people speak of immortality, they often think of statues, medals, or myths. But the truth is quieter. Immortality is when an idea keeps breathing long after its author is gone. For Lindbergh, that idea lives in every pilot who trims a throttle for precision, every engineer who tests one more variable, every person who believes that impossible is simply the word we use before we learn. Somewhere, above an ocean that has no borders, a pair of engines still hums at 1,600 RPM, steady, calm, defiant. The sound carries far, then fades into the horizon. And though the man is gone, the rhythm remains. Proof that understanding, once found, never truly lands. Even when men forget, the sky remembers. Long after the last piston engine fell silent and the final veterans drifted into memory, the air above the Pacific still holds their echoes, faint, rhythmic, unending. The world has changed. The technology has evolved. But every gust of wind still carries the same invisible hum that once guided the P-38s home. It is the music of understanding, played in the key of survival. At sunrise, when the first light touches the ocean east of New Guinea, the air turns the color of molten silver. The jungle below is quiet, the same jungle where a man with no rank once drew equations in the dirt and turned them into lifelines. Somewhere beneath those trees, the ghosts of the 475th Fighter Group wait for the morning to begin again. They were young then, 20-year-olds who trusted their instincts until a 42-year-old civilian taught them to trust their minds. And the sky has not forgotten them. In restored museums, the P-38 Lightning stands still, twin booms gleaming under spotlights, its long nose pointed slightly upward as if still seeking the horizon. Children walk past, eyes wide, reading placards about speed, range, and armament. But the numbers mean little until you imagine the hands that once rested on those throttles, the eyes that once measured distance by intuition and fear. Somewhere in that silent machine lives a ghost of calculation. 1,600 RPM, 30 inches of pressure, lean mixture, level flight. A rhythm that saved lives not through power, but through thought. When the restorers start the engines for demonstration flights, a deep vibration fills the hangar, slower than a jet's scream, more human somehow. The crowd feels it in their chests without knowing why. They don't hear Lindbergh's name, but the sky does. The veterans who remain, those few who can still remember the smell of avgas and the bite of cold at altitude, sometimes speak softly of him, the man with the quiet voice and the dangerous ideas. They call him the teacher, never the legend. Because he didn't come to be remembered, he came to prove. They tell stories to their grandchildren, not of medals, not of dogfights, but of silence. Of flying for 9 hours across water so endless it erased every sense of direction, of leaning the mixture until the engine settled into a patient hum. Of feeling for the first time that reason itself could be a form of faith. One pilot, long after retirement, once said, "When I hear that sound in my dreams, I know I'm home again, flying on numbers, not luck." That was what Lindbergh gave them, the peace of precision. History is loud with names that conquered, but soft with those who understood. Lindbergh belonged to the second kind. He didn't extend the range of an airplane. He extended the range of human thought. Every era rediscovers him in its own way. The engineer searching for efficiency, the astronaut calculating re-entry, the scientist questioning a limit that others accept. They are all his students, even if they never knew his name. And maybe that's how he would have wanted it. Anonymous but enduring, present only in the evidence. When dusk falls over the Pacific, the horizon glows with a faint copper light. In that hour between day and night, the air feels alive, as if remembering what it once carried. If you listen closely, you can almost hear them. 4. Lightnings in formation, gliding low and steady toward home. The engines whisper rather than roar. The men inside are tired, sunburned, but calm. They have learned to fly with knowledge, not fear. Below them, the sea mirrors the sky, and between the two stretches a silence vast enough to hold everything. The courage of the pilots, the mathematics of a civilian, and the quiet truth that joined them both. In the end, immortality isn't the absence of death. It's the persistence of meaning. The planes are gone, the pilots are gone, the war has long turned to dust. But every time someone questions a rule, tests a limit, or chooses understanding over instinct, a small part of that summer in 1944 lives again. That is how the sky remembers, not through monuments or medals, but through echoes of knowledge carried forward by those who still dare to measure, to question, to believe. And somewhere, far above the Pacific, perhaps in a stretch of air no map can mark, a faint vibration still moves through the wind. 1,600 revolutions per minute, steady, patient, eternal. The impossible made routine. The mortal made immortal. The sky, remembering.